Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out to Samuel Darkle, who got in touch with me in the middle of last year to recommend this week's movie. He seems like a lovely chap, and his bio does indeed confirm that he is in fact an eclectic Dutch dude. So definitely my kind of people. Samuel, thank you. You made an excellent choice. Anyway, on with the show. 1989's Nightwish is a psychological horror movie that, had it not been recommended to me, I probably would have never have found it. It's one of those movies that's fallen through the cracks of cinema history, and equally is one of those films that, in the UK at least, never made the leap from VHS to any digital format. And when I say that, I mean that it literally got a quite limited rental release in video shops with no retail version to follow up, and then it just disappeared, never to be seen again. And I think that's a real shame, as while in many ways the film is pretty straightforward, I think it actually excels in quite a few ways that make it more than worth checking out. One thing I do need to point out at the top of this review is that this film plays around with dreams and reality. As such, you're never quite sure what's really happened and what's an illusion. Which is why I'm going to keep the plot summary for this film super brief. In part because if I end up explaining the plot in the usual detail that I do, not only will I spoil half of the plot twists and give the ending away, but I'd end up explaining in extreme detail some very over-the-top situations that our characters get into that'll easily take 5 minutes to run through just to end the paragraph with, but it was a dream and then they wake up. Which just isn't really fun for anyone. So, to keep it somewhat brief, Nightwish follows a group of hired test subjects who are working on various studies around dreams. As we join the film, they've already developed the capability to capture a dream on tape and play it back on command. But now they're exploring what happens if you die in a dream. To do this, the doctors overseeing the project have taught the subjects how to control their dreams, and more importantly, how to trigger nightmares, without the ability to turn them off. Our main characters for this film are Donna, Kim, the Doc, Jack and Bill, but I personally would say that Donna and Kim are our real main characters, with the Doc, Jack and Bill playing secondary mains. Anyway, the film opens with a bit of a fake out as Donna gets chased by a cannibal maniac, only for the film to reveal that it's just a big dream, silly Billy. At which point the film's main plot starts proper, as the team is sent to investigate an abandoned house out in what looks to be some kind of desert. They go into the house to investigate suspected paranormal goings on, and while on the way up there they also discuss the various incidents that have occurred in the area they're travelling in. This includes multiple UFO sightings and a very unfortunate situation where a small town in the desert had its water supply contaminated, and the resulted contamination led to a significant proportion of the town being killed, debilitated for life, and causing the town's children to have developmental issues. A lot of the deaths happened in the house that the gang are heading to, and the Doc wants to use their various tools to capture a living, breathing spirit. But all is not so sunny in the desert town, as the Doc appears to have gone a little loopy. After what initially seemed like some playful experiments, it's quickly revealed that the ghosts may not be so make-believe as first thought. And when the Doc starts using very unconventional methods, some of which are very illegal, to try and get results, it becomes apparent that he has a much more satanic interest in the occult than a scientific one. And after Doc chains the gang up in the basement and uses them to try and summon a powerful spirit, it falls to Kim and Donna to escape, explore the house, and go and fetch help to save the rest of the team. But Doc's not alone. He's hired two of the town's children, now adults, called Wendell and Stanley. Both are very suggestible and both have the minds of their childhood selves. And you better believe that this movie is going to have a lot of chase scenes involving Kim, Donna and Stanley. In a film where you can never tell what's real and what's a dream, can Kim escape the house? Will Donna and Jack manage to outsmart the Doc and evade being grabbed by the ghoulies? And when the discovery of extraterrestrial life is revealed to the gang in the second act, does anyone have a chance of evading aliens, ghosts and Stanley? All these questions and much, much more will be answered if you take a chance on Nightwish. And this is one of those films where I don't think you'd need a film degree to figure out what's going on throughout the film's runtime, but what I really appreciate is the fact that this film leans more towards the showing rather than the telling side of the film spectrum. It would be very easy to just have our characters spewing dialogue non-stop throughout the runtime as they explain everything about the town's water supply, the aliens, ghosts, Inception-style dream machines, Doc's henchmen, parasites, the works. But this film uses some slightly subtle touches to really help keep things ticking over nicely. The actual plot of the film, while a little simplistic, is just really quite entertaining. While there are a couple of cop-out moments where you think the film's really going to kick things up a notch, only for it to then kind of undercut itself by revealing what you'd just seen was a dream, for the most part it tries to avoid cheap plot twists and ropey reveals where possible. I really enjoyed the tone of this production. It sits just on the right side of campy, and if anything I feel like they could have maybe lent a bit more into that, particularly in the second and third acts. But it is ultimately quite nice to see some restraint in place on the part of the writer and director, and the end result is a film that just stops short of going into melodrama territory, and, you know, I think it kind of works so much better for that. The pacing is a little rickety on this one, if I'm being honest. The 3-act structure kind of is a bit lopsided. The second and third acts more or less meld into each other without much of a way of a clean break. The first act's pretty solid though, and does have a nice transition into the second act as you realise the Doc isn't playing with a full deck. The first act's also quite a bit shorter than the second and third act. It would have maybe been nice to have a bit more of a clear tone change in acts 2 and 3, and maybe a bit more of a lead up to the house to help give the first act a bit of a bump up to match the second and third act's runtime. The lab scenes revolving around the dream experiments seem a bit forced as well in places. I mean, once you've seen the film all the way through once, you'll know why they're there, but on a first watch, they just seem completely out of sorts with the rest of the film and more of a distraction than anything else. The dialogue's not the worst I've seen, but it's a bit overly simplistic at times. It reminded me quite strongly of good era Full Moon, in the sense that the dialogue clearly had a theatric zeal to it, but it was just loosey-goosey enough that it felt a bit rough and naturalistic. It wasn't naturalistic enough that I felt it was believable at any point, but considering some of the direct-to-video dreck I've seen in my time, I'd say this is definitely one of the better efforts for dialogue. In fact, the only thing I disliked really about this movie from a script perspective was the ending, which I felt was a bit too obvious and a bit too heavy-handed. At times this film did impress me a bit in terms of how it would frame the narrative to purposefully wrong-foot the audience, but having grown up with movies that predominantly ask the question, what's the real dream, man? The end reveal of this film was less of an oh my god moment and more of a one, which did put a bit of a dampener on affairs, I'll be honest. The script was written and directed by Bruce R. Cook. He has 3 writing credits and 2 directing credits. On the writing front, this was his second credit, with his last contribution being 2 episodes of the TV show The New Lassie. On the directing front, this was his last credit. He seems to mainly work as a camera operator, and in that field he has the very cool honour of having done second unit photography on the Brian Usner classic Society, which in my book is some serious street cred. On the direction front, it's not half bad. It leans very heavily into mid-80s slasher territory in terms of stylisation, which is a bit odd, as given the film is a psychological horror with sci-fi elements, I personally would have said it was more aligned with the haunted house genre than the slasher genre. The actual horror side of things is probably the one element here that's played down the most, as we instead spend the majority of the runtime around a creepy house being chased by ghosts, henchmen and the occasional extraterrestrial. I do, however, think the choice to shoot it with that type of stylisation does benefit the movie quite a bit, as it gives it an uneasy quality which, in slasher films, is designed to make the audience feel uncomfortable, but in this film creates a sense of wooziness that constantly makes the film feel dreamy in terms of tone. Bruce here really has created something quite unusual visually that I feel really helps sell what the film is pushing. In particular, I love how he's used green colour gels on the set lights in places as a signifier of imminent danger or to mark when dreams are happening. I picked up on it in literally the opening scene when it appears as an odd stylistic choice behind Donna in a couple of shots. When it was revealed to be a dream, I immediately went, okay, so that's going to be the signifier. And sure enough, whenever green lighting rigs turn up on set, it's sort of a subtle visual warning that shit's about to go down. That technique is a bit of a double-edged sword though, as it did mean that from that point onwards I was spending a good chunk of the runtime keeping an eye out for green lights so that I knew which bits were real and which bits weren't. And as the film goes on, we find that even that isn't a solid signifier. While the direction on display is good, but maybe a little cookie cutter, the direction of the cast, I'd say, is actually quite a bit more stable. The performers relish the opportunity to work in the set spaces and really give it their all, using as many props as they can get their hands on. Running, walking, climbing and crawling through the various set builds and trying their best to really give memorable performances and deliveries that get the most out of what they've got to work with. The cine is quite the delight as well, and here's where I think Bruce's experience as a camera operator really came into its own, as it's clear he worked very closely with the cam team to deliver some really rather pretty experiences. Budget limitations aside, there are plenty of lovely Dutch and tracking Dutch angles, the camera really gets up close and personal to the cast, and one of the things that I quite love about this film is they kind of make this strange rocking technique with the camera where it'll track and go Dutch, but the camera almost swirls while going Dutch, making this very uneasy motion that I quite love. There is some very decent attention to detail on lighting for most of the film. It does have some weaker moments, and while this isn't perfect cine or anything I'd call art, I think it's a very strong attempt to really try something a bit different for the time, and I can only really applaud that. One thing I do want to take a moment to acknowledge is the film's practical and visual effects. Given this wasn't exactly the biggest budgeted feature of the decade, I thought it was really impressive that they actually bothered to create artificial ghosts for the movie. Yes, they're basically just green glowing tubes, but in 1988 on a low to mid-sized budget, that's quite impressive. Equally, there are several shots of alien transformations that, while not perfect, again, for the budget, are really very well handled. In fact, the only scene I don't think was handled all that well from a practical standpoint, and it may just be the very ropey copy I used to review this movie, but the alien breeding chamber wasn't the film's finest hour. It looked very fiberglassy in places, and the victims were quite hard to distinguish or see what was really going on with them. Even some minimal animation, light twitches, the occasional pulse or jerk would have probably sold the effect better. As it stands, it just looked like 2 or 3 dummies were duct taped to a wall. Performance-wise, it's just about acceptable. And I had to grit my teeth when I said that, because the cast here, while giving the director what he wants physically, just aren't really playing their A-game here. Alicia Daz is probably the strongest performer here as Kim. She really gets a more than meaty chunk of the script to work with and doesn't disappoint, giving a believably terrified performance and really being allowed to push her physicality and range to the limits. In any of the mainstream slashers of the mid-80s, she'd have been a much loved and well-remembered performance that fans would still talk about to this day. As it stands, she's in Nightwish, and no one apart from Samuel and myself have heard of this thing apparently. Elizabeth Catan comes a close second as Donna. She's a bit more limited in her scope, and I'm not entirely convinced by her panicked acting, but she's charismatic, a decent physical performer, and really throws herself into the role. The same could also be said about Jack Starrett as the Doc. He plays the Doctor's mental collapse with a muted approach, which I actually quite liked. It would have been way too easy to Professor Zaroff this thing, but by playing down the "I'm crazy I am" performance, I think he excels in really selling just how depraved he actually is. The only grievance I have with his turn in this, really, is that while I'd rather him play the performance down, I think even just a couple of explosive outbursts, even if they were only very brief, like a line or 2 tops, would have really helped get him over the line in delivering a believable mental collapse. Because, as it stands, he just comes across as a bit of a softly spoken but clearly deranged, slightly bored man. The worst performance in this is probably Brian Thompson as Dean, the big McLarge huge for this movie who plays Kim's love interest. His entire role in the film is to drive the gang to the house, get into an argument with one of Doc's henchmen who opens and closes the gate to the compound, then he starts driving home, then he turns around for some reason and goes back to the compound, and that's about it. His deliveries are all hampered with a hocking great slice of corned beef, and he feels incredibly out of place in this film. And the weirdest part is, we just keep cutting back to him just driving and listening to the radio. Like we're supposed to give a crap with what's happening to Dean in this film, when in the other movie we have spooky haunted house alien dream machine shit shows unfolding before our eyes. Apart from his final scene, which is gruesome but well handled, I literally don't see the point in him being in this movie, other than the fact that they didn't want a car to be left behind at the house, as that would make getting away too easy. And finally, the soundtrack. It's alright. It's a really nice moody synth piece which, while it works fine for the film and does show a level of craftsmanship, wasn't particularly my cup of tea. I think it's fit for purpose, but not one that I'd run out to get the vinyl of. What is more interesting is the weird and wonderful additional sounds made for this movie, with the ghosts and aliens really getting some lovely synthy oddness levelled over them to help further add to the creepy vibes they've created. In that sense, they did a lovely job. Nightwish was originally released by Medusa Home Video in 1989 as a post-cert rental tape in the UK, before it fell through the cracks and vanished seemingly forever. It never managed a home video retail release, so for us plucky Brits, that's the first and last we saw of it. Stateside, it got a VHS rental release in 1989, but in 2019 it got a full ground-up remaster and re-release by Unearthed Records. It's currently selling for about $25 on Amazon.com. No word on any extra features, so my guess is a cleaned up picture, subtitles and a trailer is about as good as it gets. Nightwish was a fun experience for me. Was it the greatest single psycho horror ever made? No, not really. A script that was a bit uneven, with a few groan-worthy cop-out plot twists, combined with a few mixed ability performances and a score that, while effective, wasn't for me, left me feeling like there was room for a bit of improvement. However, the direction and cine were a delight in an era where this kind of filmmaking was on the way out. The practical effects were decent given the budget, and with some memorable performances and an overall plot that, I have to say, I really rather got on with, I really think this film needs to be seen by a wider audience, probably as a B feature paired with something like Night of the Demons. It doesn't deserve really to be forgotten in the way that it has, and I'm very grateful to Samuel for sharing this one with me. It's available and out there, so I say go check it out.